Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to moderate this first panel here. My name is Laurent Goetschel. I am the director of swisspeace. And I will right away introduce the other persons sitting around me. To my left, Monika Bolliger. She's editor with Der Spiegel, a famous German magazine on also international politics, and she is active with Der Spiegel on the Middle East mostly. Before being with Der Spiegel for many years, she has been with the Swiss newspaper Neue Zürcher Zeitung, reporting also on the Middle East, and has been living in Jerusalem, Cairo, and Beirut in this function. To my right, Stefanie Beiler. Stefanie Beiler is a colleague of mine at the University of Basel. She's professor of political science, focusing on comparative politics, decision-making processes, and also political careers of parliamentarians. Sitting beside her is Dominik Meier. Dominik Meier is based in Berlin. He is owner and founder of Miller and Meier Consulting, one of the leading political strategy consultancies in Germany and in Europe. And finally, sitting beside Monika Bolliger is Javier Pallero. He is a political activist and tech policy analyst. He is based in Argentina, and he is also working on advocacy and freedom of expression in Argentina. So this is the personal setup here in front. Now we are getting to the context. Navigating narratives of peace. Our president of swisspeace, Jakob Kellenberger, already gave a brief definition of what he understands with narratives of peace. For him, this relates to important elements, important components of peace processes, looking at mediation, looking at transitional justice, looking as part of transitional justice also at healing processes, psychosocial approaches, so already linking over to the second panel, which we'll be having this afternoon. But we are not there yet. And I would like to start also one step before, making it a bit more simple and asking about issues linked to peace, peace objectives, peace visions in an environment mostly marked by violent conflicts, even by wars. And I thought I would ask the first question to the person viewed from a professional profile who probably mostly relates to this issue. It is the journalist on the panel, Monika Bolliger. You have been reporting on the Middle East for many years, and one may say the Middle East has never really been an extremely peaceful region. This is not an accusation towards anybody coming from this region in any way. It is a matter of fact. And in times still, peace issues, peace perspectives have been much more present than now. Now we hear very little about peace perspectives as compared to earlier periods. So my question to you, in regard also to your profession, are media people more or less loudspeakers of what's happening on the ground? Or do media people also have other possibilities, other instruments in the way they relate to what's happening, in the way they report what's happening? How do you see yourself, your role in regard to this context right now?
Well, if we're only loudspeakers, I think we have failed. But yeah, I mean, I do think we need to, first of all, report on events that are happening and try to give a picture of the reality and all its complexities. But I also think our role is to scrutinize the narratives that exist, right? So if you have warring parties that want to amplify their narratives on why they're going to war and want to justify it, I think the role of us as journalists is also to question their narratives and to question their justifications for leading a war. And at the same time, if there were times of peace, our role would be to also point at possible sources of conflict or like show where the peace might be fragile, and without calling for war, obviously, but really to point out the risks of a peace agreement that may not be super solid. And yeah, does this happen all the time? I don't think so. I think that unfortunately also media has amplified voices of war and conflicts, especially like now everybody of course thinks about Israel and the Palestinians, where it's been very polarized, and I think it's in a way or another also here polarized, and the media has not been, like the media definitely has been affected by that. So I do think sometimes Western media has sometimes, for example, uncritically just repeated what Israeli army has said, a warring party. I also noticed that Arab media has taken over sometimes the narrative of Hamas uncritically, and I think both is not very helpful. Because in the end we need to imagine also, everybody needs to be able to imagine a way out, and there have been other attempts, like The Economist has, for example, in December had an issue that may have looked a bit surreal, but it said how peace is possible, and it tried to lay out a way to peace. And I think there could be a lot of criticism on the way they did it, but I mean, they tried, and I think that should also be our role as media to not just repeat the existing narratives.
Thank you, Monika. Turning towards Dominik, we've heard the journalist speaking. Now we know, or there's a saying, that actually what happens in the public sphere, what is being reported by journalists is one thing, but there are also things happening before that, or things happening behind the scenes, public affairs, impacting on political topics, on the ways they are being debated. We are more or less familiar with this at the national level. We are less familiar with this at the international level. And yet, we know also there things are happening. So now relating to what we just heard, and in view of your professional background and activities, what's happening now in regard to particular conflicts? And we don't ask you to, relate some professional secrets whatsoever, but just in principle, I mean, are there also activities behind the scenes in which narratives are being shaped, are being prepared, and then things develop more or less according to certain spin doctors behind the scene?
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's difficult to be here. Thank you for the experiment that I can speak. It's also complicated to speak after you, Monika, because the media role is so important in peace and war situation every time, because the only people with more balanced pictures who can tell everybody are the medias worldwide. So I'm impressed about the work. Unfortunately, I'm on the other side of the picture. So I'm kind of organizer or consultant of narratives. Not to produce narratives, but to organize. And it's complicated because public affairs is more oriented in the question that companies have to negotiate between political systems, economic systems, and civil society. And the key element of us, of our work, of the practical work, so I'm not a doctor and a professor, I'm a practical guy, is in this case most to help top organizations, mainly big companies, global companies, to understand national and international politics. Especially in the peace and war scenery, it's the only one important issue. This is defense politics. The question of arm controls, and of course, also the question of weapon exports. High complicated issues. This means how you can bring weapons from A to B. What's allowed, what's not, or not. Take Russian-Ukrainian war, really, really complicated issues. It's one of our tasks, not to build narratives, but to support, to give positioning of top organizations to be involved in this complicated issue. And it's really, really complicated. So it's not nothing to do with narratives. But on the other hand, public affairs has this famous part of campaigning. In these political campaigning issues, public diplomacy. This means nation branding, country branding. You have a transparency side, take also complicated issues like Qatar, the World Cup, big campaigns, reputation campaigns. On the other side, hidden campaigns, take the famous Brussels Qatar gate. This means that it is clear that it's not only communication publicly, and you can go on the famous Wikipedia site about country branding, and you can see indirect campaigning strategies from agencies for reputation management under the umbrella to bring national issues to the people. You can see it in Kazakhstan, you can see it in Israel, you can see it in Taiwan, you can see it in Russia. It's a highly complicated issue. But it's done, and I think it's, for me, complicated to speak about this, but it's a part of building narrative is to organize narratives. And people, spin doctors, create this. And it's an all-important ethical decision of everybody in our business to be part of this or not. This is a key element of our work. And one special task in War and Peace is not the question of conflict prevention. The most important point to build narratives is coming before. It's the question of the political campaigning in the campaigns of politicians, on parliamentarians. It's much more important sometimes for crisis prevention than the issue of peace and war mediation processes. How you organize this kind of political campaigning in the questions of who could be president, prime minister in XYZ countries, take Africa or elsewhere. This is the most important element you have to take into account. And one important point is to make a big and difference between in and out. People like me, consultants, we are outside. We're helping. We're supporting in social media, perhaps, to organize social media campaigns, and so on. You will speak later about this. That's one point. But we are not in the strategy, in the narrative building, in the top-level decision-making process, who is responsible to produce a narrative. We are completely out. That's only internal, closed-shop business. And people, consultancies who think the jobs are a little bit the outside supporting. We understand communication strategies, instruments, and so on. Also, we have to take this into account. Now we have to stop. But it was important to me to make the difference, public affairs, campaigning, and the question of how you organize this kind of things in a clear manner. And we need the media to find out who is behind this campaign sometimes, who is behind social media campaigns, to make clear that's how kind of fake news manipulation systems are function. And it's naive to think that this point of campaigning systems, narrative, building and communication is one of the most important topics in the last 5 years in bring interest or narratives to people. And social media is, I think, the most important point for the moment. Much easiest way to produce fake news.
We will get to social media soon, but before we do this, I would like to ask Stefanie Bailer regarding politicians. Dominik already mentioned politicians and their agendas. So I think one can say that most politicians don't build their political careers mostly based on foreign policy issues. We know this is for sure the case in Switzerland, but I think it also counts for other countries. But recently we could observe political representatives of all possible political colors embracing very clear-cut positions on many different issues linked to war and peace. So Stefanie, how do you explain this sudden shift in interest, at least perceived from the outside, and maybe already linking it up to the next panelist? I mean, do social media also play a particular role in this? What would you say?
Yeah, of course, social media play a big role in that. I mean, traditionally, we have quite a gap between knowledge of citizens and parliamentarians. They actually are often quite far apart, and particularly in foreign affairs, where we have often not a lot of knowledge. Voters care about the economic vote, they care about unemployment and a lot of domestic issues, while foreign policy plays really a secondary role. However, that of course changes when you have such a massive conflict, such as Ukraine, Gaza-Israel conflict. All of a sudden you have this conflict very near the door, and people are afraid and they really worry, and then they expect a reaction, and politicians feel they have to react all of a sudden. And it was easier not to react before social media. Now social media has changed communication totally. No parliamentarian can afford not to have a social media account. They are expected to communicate. And it's easier in a case like Ukraine, where good and bad are relatively easy to capture, where you have to take a stand, you have a little Ukrainian flag, you clearly symbolize. And it's so much more demanding when it gets complex, such in the Israel-Gaza conflict. People worry here for days why the city administration hasn't put out the Israeli flag. Should they have done it at all or not, and why was it late? And each parliamentarian has to ask himself, herself, how do I react on social media? How fast? How profound? I mean, they have whole teams debating that. And that's a major challenge now, that you have so many actors who have to react in very complicated issues, and it can't be taken back. It can be it's very hard to correct, so it's a lot of stress. And voters punish if you don't react, but the correct reaction is quite demanding. So it is quite complex, and so all of a sudden we have so many additional political actors voicing a position in really complicated affairs. And that's a challenge. It's also maybe a little bit of promise. I can outline that later on, what sort of the advantages of that could be. But at the moment, it is a challenge for also international actors who have to deal with international relations. Do they really want to have hundreds additional foreign policy actors giving their opinion on complicated conflicts?
That's indeed a good question, but we will get back to it later on. Javier, social media, the digital space was mentioned several times. Of course, this space is often associated also intimately with the role of civil society actors, but not only. Focusing now on this space, digital space, how is it in the end affected by war? I mean, it is often mentioned, particularly in the circles of peacebuilding activists and researchers, as a big opportunity to be more inclusive, to help shape processes. Now we also get the impression, actually, it's maybe the opposite. What would you say?
Well, that's a very interesting question. So I think that from a civil society perspective, having worked in that field for 9 years now, I can say that I've seen the evolution of what the digital space means for us, for peace-building work and narratives, but also for other human rights activism, right? So the first thing that comes to mind when you want to think about political impact and civil society in the digital sphere is the Arab Spring, maybe, right? This, let's say, optimistic view that the internet is a tool for change in itself, right? And just for having the internet in certain place, you would be able to show the atrocities that a bad government is committing, or to show the impact of war. And also, just because you give this kind of communication, then people will be able to organize themselves and maybe overthrow a government that is bad, and create this benevolent image of what happens when you have social media involved. That might have been, let's say, partially true in the early stages of what we saw in the developments of social media, but nowadays we've seen the other perspective, right? What happens with disinformation, with the polarization online, with communities that are actually, in some cases, destroying themselves. You can see this impact in the politics of several countries around the world. You know the cases of the US, you know the cases that you have here in Europe. I won't speak to you about your own challenges here, but for example, in Argentina, where I come from, we have now the first president, let's say, of this new wave of right-wing populism that is expressed very strongly through social media, right? That is strong on memes and on hate campaigns and trolls mobilizing to silence entire groups, right? So one thing that I should probably address immediately in this first intervention is that for civil society, it is always very difficult to generate impact in decision makers. It was difficult with governments, and now it's getting increasingly difficult with this new power, with the social media companies, for example. Internet companies intervene in our communications in lots of ways. Telecommunications infrastructures may choose, for example, to make business with authoritarian governments and create internet shutdowns. Payment processors, for example, can choose to leave out of their payment system, their online payment system, to entire communities like sex workers in the US, for example. But social media companies are, we may say, one of the most impactful ones, because they have, for the lack of a better word, and having the advantage of having a journalist in the table, they have an editorial discretion over what they allow in their messaging and in their platforms. And the interesting thing about this is that this compounds the problem of concentrated media and maybe biased media in some cases to a new different level, which is person-to-person interaction. Before, you probably had to read a newspaper or see a news channel or different kind of media that were part of the same conglomerate, and then you have an editorial policy, maybe, right, that maybe you don't like. I don't want to name certain media, but you can probably imagine, right? But right now, you could probably see that and believe that and be in that bubble, but you have other options. You can just switch the channel. Right now, with social media, you have only one set of content moderation rules and content recommendation criteria in certain dominant platform, and that intervenes between you and your neighbor, right? It intervenes in your ability to communicate a message and for the other person to react to the message. So it's in the micro level. That kind of intervention, that kind of twisting, of warping of the reality that is shared by people is very, very important and impactful for building consensus, which is something that, if we don't have it, we will have a very, very difficult problem trying to build peace, right? So that's the first thing that I want to drop by, which is this difficulty in this new actor. Of course, there are dimensions to that, and there are probable interventions that we can make in order to address that, but I will stop right there so we can just keep having the conversation.
I almost already hoped you would continue, but we can get back to it.
Sure.
We can get back to it later on. Monika, when you hear all of this, particularly also the role of social media, the role of particular ways of using or guiding, containing what is being said or not said on social media. I mean, are these elements which you take into account when you're reporting about certain events, be they more peaceful or more warmonger types? I mean, is this also reflected in the way you describe what's happening? Or do you still focus mostly on how to say, events in the field and statements by authoritative actors. Or put differently, I mean, is the way journalism functions, the way journalist reports, affected by new spaces and new means?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is affected because we all have social media accounts and we all have our people that we follow and we are all in our algorithms, right? Right now, again, with Israel-Palestine, there is a lot of pressure to take sides or to use words or not use words for, you know. And I think we cannot, I mean, for Gaza right now, there is not a lot of options to get news out because Israel is not allowing any foreign journalists in. So we have to rely on reports from the people on the ground, and part of it comes through social media. Of course, I mean, I don't take reports from social media and publish them. We try to find our own witnesses and try to document things, and it's extremely difficult because people often don't have internet for days, and if they can speak, they are often so traumatized that they don't find the right words. So this is a huge challenge, and at the same time, we have all these horrifying images coming out on social media, and there is a lot of pressure and also an urge for us. We feel like we need to report on this, but at the same time, it's extremely difficult. And I have been limiting my time on social media and also images. I have been really trying to focus on being in touch with contacts myself and talking to them, because otherwise I think I would feel overwhelmed, and there is so many things and you cannot verify everything all the time. But at the same time, yeah, I think there is a lot of pressure, and I think understandably so, also from people who see things on social media and they do not see it in our media sometimes. Yeah, I find it challenging to deal with that. I also stopped posting myself stuff on social media since before that war, but I feel like it's too time-consuming because you think about every word that you put there and how could someone maybe misunderstand or use it against you. And at some point I felt like for me I'd rather focus on my writing because that's enough work, and yeah, I just don't have time to engage in these sometimes very polarized debates.
Stefanie, you said politicians cannot afford to close their social media account or to stop posting. At the same time, you also put as a question, do we really want to have hundreds or thousands of foreign policy experts? So now if we see how complex situations in the field are being reflected, used in communication by politicians, I mean, maybe even if you haven't done so much research, particularly on foreign policy issues, but I know you've done research on other relations between social media and politicians. How does it impact on them and the way they communicate?
Well, it's a bit funny because there is this gap. So all politicians in the Western world we look at have this strong feeling they need to have a social media account. So they all have them and they communicate. On the other side, they actually do not have that many followers. So if we look at the actual numbers, how many people follow parliamentarians, it's not that many, and not that many citizens inform themselves via social media. However, a relevant role do journalists play because they follow the parliamentarians and they are a little bit the loudspeakers. So it is fair to assume that there is a very direct communication line now between citizens and parliamentarians. And for me, as a parliamentarian researcher, that's heaven, because before I had to go to constituency assemblies or sort of clinics where parliamentarians talk to voters, extremely intensive, asking them for their emails, they wouldn't give me to them. Now I sit in front of the computer and read how they communicate with voters. And that's beautiful data material, so we look at what they say, how often, and we are only starting to really interpreting what they say, what they talk about, and what the reactions are. We have a bit of knowledge so that voters really appreciate that parliamentarians interact with them sensibly, which images they send or so, but actually whether voters appreciate foreign policy content or whether they appreciate rather economic content, we are not there yet. I mean, we have an immense mass of information, and we struggle also with the social media companies who don't all give us this content. So we have to download it on a daily basis, and then it's so much data, we have to interpret it and so on. On the other hand, it's a beautiful tool to quickly react to important situations. For example, from previous foreign policy studies, we know that there's this rally around the flag effect. When you have a massive crisis or a war, voters, citizens rally around the government and start supporting it. In a way, a fear reaction. They need a certain security in a very complex, dangerous situation. You had that during the Falklands War. Thatcher benefited from that rally around the flag effect. You had that during the COVID crisis. That sort of support for governments was going up in times of trouble. It doesn't hold very long, but parliamentarians have to serve that that demand, and if they're clever, they do so and say, yes, we react, we are worried, we do something. And as I said, it's not clear whether they are also able to say, well, I'm challenged by that. Let me think for a week and then give a statement. That would often be recommended, but they think they feel the pressure to react fast, and maybe they also overestimate how demanding voters are, because from other studies we know actually citizens appreciate it if sometimes politicians say, oh, I don't know, or oh, I have to apologize, I made a mistake there. So maybe they come into that situation that they think, I have to have an opinion on everything, which is extremely demanding on such fast, complex, evolving conflicts such as Gaza and Israel, where we are all so dependent on clever journalists who are even in the problem that they often do not have good sources, or who still struggle to get enough sources. So maybe they should just be sometimes more honest and say, yeah, I don't have to comment on everything, but voters should give them the chance to do so.
Dominik, I understand that, core foreign security policy orientation issues are closed business, as you described this. Governments decide on their own with the help of public administration, of course. But then there are certain issues which have to be dealt with in interaction with the public, at least in democracies, probably also in other states, but particularly in democracies. And I imagine certain of this, some of these issues are at least indirectly linked to conflicts or peace situation, when thinking, for example, about migration issues, or when thinking about weapons exports regulations, or when thinking about certain legal international justice issues which may also be tackled or not at the national level. So there, some communication needs to take place. Now, how would one imagine is this being organized? Is this being organized in the same way as, if it's about regulations on tobacco or on car emissions? Or is it particular because there is this, I would dare to say, higher complexity and maybe also higher uncertainty about foreign policy, security policy, foreign contexts, multiplicity of actors? Is this a specific field?
Next tries, you are really clever. First, I would like to come to an important point. Communication about peace and war narratives are completely different in communication styles like social welfare, still migration. So also social media-wise. This is more in German politics, a bubble. So Twitter, social media is often kind of fighting between parties and top politicians about opinion making, or mobilization in and outside. with the pandemic issue and the Russian-Ukraine war, the first time this kind of bubble was opened in campaigning. This was really relevant for everybody. So in German parliament, everybody understands something about Russian-Ukraine, and all the green parliamentarians are expert in weapon export and arm controls. Really like Joschka Fischer in the past time, these people are really now in the subject. So they understand much more broader, how important foreign politics is. On the other hand, you have the German history, and this makes really clear that we have a peace narrative, and the only solution of German answers in war situation is check diplomacy, you come with money, and change through trade. Like we have done it also in the Russian conflict situation before Crimea ticket. The question also of Europe was change through trade. This change now is something in the whole German politics. This is a narrative change. And to be honest, never overestimate politicians in strategy making. All the politicians are human beings like everybody, concentrate on daily business, and sometimes you didn't know what they're doing in the evenings if you think this cannot be happened. Yeah. But strategy building in communication is different from the narratives, but in the instrument, in the organization of the instruments, the same, absolutely the same. There's nothing different outside of the narratives and the question of targeting. What kind of targeting? What kind of groups you would like to speak about? And take it in war situation, like now the Israel-Gaza conflict. Only one point. Also in all the European capitals, like also Germany, you have special envoys, special people from the Israeli side and from the Palestinian side, going to the SPIEGEL and to all the magazines and newspapers, all the politicians, and try to explain the narratives. All the time. Top people make behind why Israel is in a good situation or not in a good situation. This is ongoing direct influencing. And the key element also more than in other campaigning issues is indirect communication. It's so complicated in war and peace narratives to communicate directly because it's the question of credibility. So this alliance building is the question. So you have famous think tanks sometimes. I think when you can speak about the needs, how many think tank systems you have. You need indirect alliance structures to speak for you, for credibility reasons. And this is the key element, I think, in strategic campaigning for the moment, in war and peace narratives in Europe, to find indirect ways of direct communication for credibility building to convince people. But at the end, it's not only social media, it's also in German politics or in European, and I think in worldwide politics, face-to-face communication to convince people. Well.
Javier, now I'm linking up actually to the first question I asked to you. Social media, digital space, in a controversial perspective. I mean, on one side, new openings, possibilities to speak up, to be heard, also for, let's say, non-experts and even non-politicians. Yeah. On the other side, the difficulty to also use this space in a way which goes into a distinct direction. It could also open up the perspective of information chaos, of losing the oversight, of being totally disoriented, of being only polarized. I mean, is this, how to say, how is it problematized? How do you work on this in the fields you're experienced with?
Well, as you just rightly said, how to problematize this is one of the key aspects, right? How to formulate the right questions. I would say that one of the first things that, there's all kinds, of course, of researchers and civil society. I will say what I think is the ideal take on this, which is not what many are doing, because of course civil society, as any other actor, are also subject to the preferences of funders or the influence of what is, you know, the big thing in the space to talk about. So that puts some kind of, you know, incentives in place. But I would say what is the most important aspect from my perspective. So the first thing is to put technology in its right place. There's a lot of determinism in this, meaning that, as I said before, there was this initial idea that the internet was the solution for everyone, and then connectivity became an objective for the world, right? It's like connectivity will solve everything: education, women inclusion, economic, social economics, and of course political participation. Well, that is an exercise in determinism, right? It's a positive aspect. But now we have some kind of negative determinism, which is saying that the internet is to be blamed by all of the problems, right? So we need to put the technology in its rightful place, which is neither of that, right? It's not the doom of everything, and it's not the salvation for everything. We need to recognize the persistent inequalities. We need to recognize the social and economic sufferings that some of these people and populations are having around the world, and the discontent and the crisis of institutions that we are seeing everywhere in the West, right? And that is not only because of the internet, it's because of several other issues, right? Lack of inclusion, climate emergency, and so on. There's several aspects, right, in the, let's say, in the loss of credibility of institutions in many places in the world, because that's what is common also, not only the internet, but that's also some other common aspect across several places in the world where we see political crisis right now. So you have that. Once you put the internet in its rightful place, then you have several things to study. For example, the issue of concentration that I mentioned before. So one thing that civil society has been raising the alarm in is the concentration of the internet. The aspect of the internet that makes it, it still makes it a good tool, for political organizing and for advancement. It's its capacity to be a decentralized network, meaning that you, being a government or a company, can't exert absolute control over it. You can't censor information very easily, as you do before, right? Well, that is changing right now because it's getting increasingly centralized. You have a handful of companies, maybe we can name 5 or 6, that control all of the social media platforms, the most used email and web search service, among other services, one of the 2 most used operating systems for phones, for example, that's Google, right? So when you have these high levels of concentration, you are subject, again, as I said, to the politics and the preferences of just a very small cast of corporate decision makers that will impose their view on the rest of the world. For example, let me give you a very specific example. Meta, the company that is the parent company of Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, right? They have one joint criteria to determine, for example, what kind of user is considered a terrorist or a violent extremist, right? And that criteria is informed by the list that the US government has of terrorist organizations, which you may agree with. There are some obvious cases and some other not so obvious cases, right? And as you know, and some political actors say, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, right? So in that case, you have an example of one policy that is set by a company that affects a huge number of people. Again, WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook. Imagine the numbers of these people, right? The number of users that you can affect. There's also the definition of policies. For example, defining what is misinformation or what is disinformation. This is something that in the disinformation studies field is an issue in itself, how to define disinformation, right? Actually, most of the instances I've worked in disinformation in the past election in Argentina, and one of the most interesting things is that the most impactful stories are not necessarily lies or disinformation, information built to deceive necessarily, but it's all of the other information that is often cataloged as misinformation that lacks context, lacks nuance, right? But it's not necessarily false. It's just a picture of reality. It's like a portion of reality that omits other parts, but it's not lying, right? It's giving you exactly what you want to see or what you want to hear. So that kind of thing that is not necessarily misinformation, you can't forbid that in a rule, right? we're talking about the terms of use of the companies that forbid certain types of content over others. You can have a rule that says, okay, I'm going to forbid misinformation in my platform. Okay, define this information. Well, it's this, but what about that? So it goes again into this cat and mouse game in which several actors are, in many cases, in good faith, trying to solve a problem that they also created, right? With two different teams, the commercial team that is driving engagement because more screen time is more data, and more data is more information to sell to advertisers. So that team is working on that. And there's another team across the aisle, often very small, that is working on trust and safety to avoid misuse of the platform. So these two teams are working against each other within the same company. This is fascinating, right? So you have to define actors, you have to define behaviors, and lastly, you have to define content. It's not a matter of finding the right rule to forbid the right thing or the bad thing. It's not only content. It's about how these platforms work. As you were talking about politicians, here you have a whole new dimension that goes beyond the content of the message. It goes about reach. Right now, anyone has global reach. In Argentina, for example, Giorgia Meloni is a star in some circles, right? In some right-wing circles, because the reach now goes way beyond what it was before. Javier Milei, our president right now, after his speech at Davos, is becoming like an influencer around the world. That's reach. You also have a permanence, right? This framework about reach permanence, is work by researchers like Agustina del Campo, whose work I recommend. You have the permanence, which is you have the message that is there forever. So as you said, also, sometimes you self-censor because you know that this is going to stay there forever, right? Some other people don't care, but many do, right? And also you have this element in which technology is built to achieve that, but the institutions and our responses as consumers of information are not ready for that kind of reach, for that kind of permanence, right? So say that studying these issues and putting the concepts in the right place will allow us to find new ways of addressing this, including decentralizing social networks. There are interesting examples already. There's nice social media, in case, there's hope. There's projects like Blue Sky, for example, which is like a Twitter alternative in which you can choose the kind of algorithm that you will use to filter the information you want. You're not only tied to one, you can choose different ones, for example, right? These servers are federated, they're not controlled by one company. Several people can mount their own servers and they all interact, right? So you have an example there, how you can deal with concentration. And lastly, the DSA, the Digital Services Act here in Europe, is a great example of how you can use regulation to incentivize good outcomes, including sharing information for researchers under Article 14, which is mandatory now for companies to share information with researchers in order to try to tackle these problems. So there are some solutions. It's not all, bad news.
Yeah, it's always good to finish a statement with a glimpse of hope. Monika, Javier said that actually it's not only about misinformation, it's about selective, maybe even very selective information. So traditionally one would have said, well, it belongs to the task of journalists, at least of good journalists, to complement the picture, to try to give, for sure, a simplified, but yet a more or less comprehensive picture of what's happening in a context. Now, it was also mentioned that journalists more and more also are active on social media, and I've heard that in certain media companies, clicks are also counted regarding the digital editions of the media outlets. So, doesn't this contradict this traditional, positive, comprehensive representation of context, or how do you cope with this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a huge pressure. And the conflict you described within social media companies of two different departments working against each other, we have that within, right? We have writers who really try to show a complex reality in most cases, who try to do justice to what they have learned and seen. And it's not always black and white, obviously. And on the other hand, we have people at the news desk who are driven by the incentive of getting a lot of clicks, a lot of people staying on the website and maybe making a subscription or something, right? So there is this struggle about titles, about teasers, about, and it's an ongoing issue that a writer would complain about a title someone else put because they feel like the title does not represent their piece. I mean, I think this has been the case also before, but it's stronger, and the pressure is high. I also think there's a lot of challenges in this pressure of putting out quantity. Like, we need to. The logic of the SPIEGEL website, for example, is that it works with a lot of traffic, and the more people go there often and see something they want to read, and then they make a subscription or just a trial subscription, the more money we make, basically, right? So, but this somehow leads sometimes to a dynamic where we produce more content than one person can read. Like, we produce way more. And sometimes it can also lead to really good, nuanced, well-researched articles disappearing after 1 hour, and because it needs the pace needs to continue, right? So I don't really have an answer to this. I'm from the writer's side. I would like to have it slower. I would like to for things to really slow down, but someone needs to make the money also, right, for us, that we can do the writing. And I think this is a very complex situation, and I don't think anyone has the perfect answer to that.
Dominik, let's imagine, maybe it exists, I don't know, you might tell us, but let's at least imagine that you would have some client who would tell you, actually, I want to go for peace. Yeah? Peace in a way that, well, usually the complexity of a situation, so the difficulty Monika was just describing, would need to be accounted for, because there's no way to move towards peace without, I mean, now at the communicative level, yeah, without being able to relate, at least to a certain extent, the different positions and the complexity of a given situation, in order to open up the space to see different positions and to be aware that it's not a black and white situation. So, would you be pleased about such a client, or would you say that's impossible, or if you wouldn't say the latter, how would you proceed?
Listen, I come back to my point. For every agency, consultancy in this business, it's a question of your own ethical standards, what you have, and like with the media, like we have to say yes or no. In social media, that's the key point, is black and white. We have so many debates about also in the media world to stop all the commentaries next to the articles because you cannot control anymore. So this black and white in social media is one of the key problems what we still have done with our instruments in communication to come to this point, but you cannot solve it. What we need is, and we need a lot of money for this, and coming back, we need an independent media system well paid, because this is a key element how we can organize worldwide in kind of take it watchdogs, who, like you're working on it, to make really clear that are standards of communication, standard of media, standard of human rights, standard of liberal rights, perhaps not democracy, but liberal rights, but also to understand, like Monika mentioned, not to be naive. It's also an important point in communication. Also for us, it's the question of, okay, how you interpret that context. And I can tell you, on the big platforms, the big Silicon Valley companies or American companies, how complicated is the filtering system. This company has thousands of people employed to find solutions to stop this kind of right-wing, left-wing, or kind of anti-human being context. But still, for us, and this is a key element for everybody in our business, we have to think, okay, communication is dependent on context, on narratives. And You can influence narratives, but you don't build it as an organizer. Germany has a special history. Switzerland has a special history. And I think we have to understand the consequence from our communication work. And I can say to everybody, also I'm the president of the German and European Association of the Political Consultants, at the end it's everybody in this room, everybody, to decide what you want to do. You want to fight or to fight not? It's everybody. And that's also for our company. So we stopped this a long time ago. Because at the end, you cannot work for two sides. You cannot work for politicians, top dimensions, 3-5 people working together and decide, or you're an outsider. You work for companies or big institutions. It's not possible, in or out. There's a clear picture to make a difference. And coming back, yes, you can, in the new communication world and politics, also in America, worldwide, or still in China, if more than 4 or 5 people are involved in one strategy, the strategy is one day later public. This is new media systems. You cannot avoid it. And the question of transparency is how you can balance this, how you can understand it. And for us, still for people like you, it's not possible without a lot of experience and context knowledge to find ways through this. And we don't speak about artificial intelligence. The next problem what we will have, you speak about algorithm. The next stage is LLM, so learning machine program systems who build this without any control of human beings. It's still function. It's starting now. So we make a complete communication site and nobody of human being is still behind. And this is the next step what we're working on it. And an important point for the Basel Peace Forums in the next year to understand this kind of narratives. Narratives building by algorithm, not anymore by human beings. It's still starting in function. Starting. Sorry, not positive ending.
No, I was just thinking about seeing myself here next year, having invited an algorithm to talk with me.
Perhaps too early. But
I'm not there. I haven't had enough alcohol yet to imagine this. But
come on, in 3 years, this is reality. In 3 years, this is reality. Completely communication systems are done by bots, by KI.
Yeah, please.
I mean, can I ask a question about that? Because I was wondering also when you, and it is maybe also a question about how much KI can actually replace journalists. I mean, to which degree do you also have the feeling you write for decision makers? That's a question to you, Monika. I mean, because must be super disappointing to have these super researched articles from areas where we are totally dependent on journalists to get this insight, and then they disappear and go down. But to which degree that you actually do you have the feeling that you can influence the narratives, how politicians see it by your articles? Do you sometimes get feedback from politicians saying, oh, wow, I saw this conflict from, I mean, that would be a bit exaggerated, but you gave me a new perspective on that. Because wouldn't that be the hope that sort of the decision makers read that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, hope never dies. Yeah. But I mean, I don't get direct feedback from decision makers, and I think if they would, if ever something really changed their mind about something, I don't think they would admit it openly or like send an email and say this. But yeah, I mean, I think at least there is a perception that we do have some impact because of how angry sometimes people get, because people seem to believe that what we do does have an impact. But yeah, I'm also not naive. Like, I mean, politicians have media, but they also have other sources, and they have their interests and the reasons why they act in a certain way. And I'm not sure that this is necessarily driven by the way media writes about things that much. I mean, I think we do have an influence, and there can be pressure like on a politician if it gets strong, but I think one single article will not really...
Not necessarily, but I mean, it could be interesting to analyze who retweets your articles, who likes them, and so on, and whether decision makers, parliamentarians amongst that. I mean, that's open data, so...
Yeah, I mean, I'm not tweeting anymore, so I don't know.
Oh, just the articles, yeah.
Yeah.
Javier, and that's the last question from my side before I will open for questions from your side to the virtual and to the physically present participants. I mean, this leaves you, I mean, not you as an individual, but you as a profession, with a very high responsibility. I mean, in terms of contributing to shaping the space in which this type of exchanges take place, and this type of space ultimately impacts also on the content. And the possibility to debate and to be open to diversities of opinions, to move forward through communication. I mean, how do you see this?
Well, as you say, I think that civil society has a lot of... there's a big challenge for civil society, and as you say, it's an opportunity to make impact. What I would say is that we need to invest more in civil society. So international cooperation should look again at civil society, especially at digital rights activism. I think there's a lot of funding and support that has moved from general digital rights activism toward more specific, thematically oriented aspects. And it needs to go back a little bit to the core funding and to core support for digital rights organizations. I am an independent researcher now, so I'm not affiliated to any organization, but I see it in that way. I see that there's a lot of, for example, misinformation, disinformation was, it was named as, I think, the top priority or problem at the Davos conference recently for the future, and it's a hot topic now, or AI, which are very important topics indeed, but these core considerations that we have been making about how the space is shaped, how freedom of expression can properly be, enjoyed online and so on, those are very old questions that seasoned experts and digital rights organizations have been trying to answer. They have been doing great contributions to the internet that we have today. The good parts, the improvements that have happened, for example, the Santa Clara Principles for Content Moderation, just to find one thing, the good things that are used now as examples of what should happen, the very good parts that are contained in the DSA, for example, all of that is the fruit of civil society advocacy, lobbying, and support, right? So we need to just keep investing in those very basic, areas of research, like basic privacy, basic freedom of expression, and so on. And also in the aspect of economic concentration, I think we have a lot to see, a lot to show. As I said, there are alternatives to be explored. And I think that we should not despair. Civil society needs to send a message that is more hopeful and more interesting. We see everywhere that some of my colleagues in civil society would like to ring a bell with alarm. It's like saying AI is coming for your jobs, or this information is going to destroy democracy, and etc. Right? These are real challenges. There are aspects of that are exactly true, but at the same time, there's a lot of good things that we can take from this. There's accountability that is possible. As Dominik was saying, LLMs and AI are coming for us, but there's people programming that. There are people prompting those systems in order for them to do something. So there's people to be held responsible, right? There are systems that can be, at some point at least, scrutinized, regulated, right? So we need to send also a message of possibility, that things are possible, that change is possible, right? And I think that is also a challenge for civil society in these times.
Thank you.